Hello, everybody, and welcome to our March event in the Development and Photography Ethics series. In this series, we have monthly public webinars that host conversations on doing development work and also capturing photography and using different visuals. So my name is Dr. Catherine Gresham, and I'm co-hosting this series with Alice Chota. I'm a development researcher, and Alice is a communications expert and a photographer. And we've been working together for several years now, and we came to realize that a lot of the ethical questions we have around development and photography are actually really similar. And we have a very keen interest in working as ethically as possible in the work that we do. So that's a little introduction to the series, and today we are absolutely delighted and thrilled to host Professor Gillian Rose. So Gillian is the head of the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford, and yeah, she's ideally suited to be a part of this series actually, because her work is concerned with different types of ethical issues in research, such as the politics of knowledge production. I mean, who creates what kind of knowledge, how that knowledge circulates and transforms, and also has made huge contributions in the field of visual ethics. And Gillian is a world-renowned cultural photographer, and much of her work draws on feminist theories of visualization, which we're going to be hearing a little bit about today. So what I'm going to do is, we've pre-recorded our discussion, and I'm going to play that now. And then we're going to go to a live Q&A. So please do post your questions in the chat for Gillian at any time, and we'll get to as many as possible in the time that we have. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. So Gillian, thank you so much for joining me today. It's so great to have you as part of our seminar series. I was wondering if you could start by telling us why photography and visual methods are so important in research, and why they may be chosen in favour of other non-visual research methods.
Okay, well, thanks, Catherine, Elise. I was really happy to be invited to talk and discuss these things with you. And that's a great question to start with. So why visual research methods and photography in particular? I mean, I suppose I should flag, as a geographer, discipline with a long history of using all sorts of different visuals, actually, that of course visual research methods are not just around, not just involving using photography, but still, I think I have a broad sort of approach to thinking around methods, which is really to sort of take a step back and think about really more about methodology. And always, the first question I think a researcher needs to ask is what kind of evidence do you need to answer the research question that you've defined? So what kind of evidence is appropriate, or most robust, or most insightful? And I think that using visual research methods, there's nothing inherently better about them. I think it really depends on the kind of evidence you need to generate. And I think often, maybe less so now, but visual research methods had a moment of being seen as very sort of innovative and new and exciting. Everybody was rushing off to do them. And I think, sometimes not pausing enough to say, well, are they really producing the kind of robust evidence that as social scientists, we are expected to produce, robust or appropriate or whatever. And I think that generates a second question, which again, I think is something that perhaps isn't asked enough in debates about visual research method, which is, if you're producing images that are going to work as evidence, how are you theorising the status of the images that are being produced? Which sounds rather a grand question, but I think it really matters. It makes a big difference if you're thinking about images, photographs as descriptions of a kind of reality. So photo documentation, those sorts of methods. Whether you're thinking about them as representations of a particular social situation, and I think a lot of photo elicitation depends absolutely on the idea that the images kind of represent a particular identity or worldview or experience of place or something, or whether you're thinking of them more as a kind of medium that could convey something uniquely, that's unique to the visual, that's, let's say talk can't. So that often people say, well, I'm interested in affect or sense of place, or these very tactile or something, kind of non-verbal kind of approaches. Now that those are not mutually exclusive necessarily ways of thinking about images, but again, if a visual method works for you or not, it depends in part on that sense of what is a visual, and why might it be helpful for you to answer your question.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think with those that desire to represent something comes with a large number of questions around the ethics of doing so, and who you are and what you are trying to represent. So I was wondering, why do you think that an approach to visual ethics in particular is needed? Are there other concerns as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think as with all social research, but I think visuals perhaps more so maybe in some ways. I think it's really important to explore the ethics of the kind of images that you're working with, and I would say that's actually true both of images that you might create, or your research participants might create, but also if you're working with kind of archival or found images as well. And I think that's because the visual, is an incredibly powerful mode of constructing social difference, in effect, I suppose, to put it in a sort of headline. So I think the way that social relations in particular work is very often mediated through how things look, particularly how people look, how places and people look, and particularly feminist work, lots of critical race theory would have, there's decades and decades of work that explores how gender, race, other forms of social difference are absolutely inscribed through particular visual regimes, both of particular bodies being represented, displayed, put on display in particular ways, but also about how that putting on display also constitutes a way of seeing as well, that the people doing the seeing are also made as part of those kind of regimes. And I think, again, as a geographer, probably the first sort of literatures I really began to explore this through was a lot of work looking at the ways in which photography was used in projects of empire and colonialism. Geography and anthropology have both, there's lots of really important work there. That talks about, as I say, the sort of the power relations that images are embedded in, and these can work in really more everyday ways as well. Things like selfies or family photography or whatever. So I think in all those for all those reasons, it's really important to think around what kind of images are being used, in what kinds of ways, by who, and the kind of power dynamics of all of that. And that's absolutely what the question of ethics also then addresses.
Yeah, interesting. I think that there seems to be sort of a mainstream approach to visual ethics that's probably come about as a result of that historical legacy of power imbalances in the way that visual ethics has been approached. Can you tell us a bit more about what the mainstream approach is and where you think the main weaknesses lie in that approach?
Okay, so I think this is an evolving area, and I mean, conversations like the ones that you've been convening in this series are absolutely, I think, sort of expanding, the range of debates here. I think the sort of standard approaches to visual research ethics, I think actually, from my sort of tracking of them, really are framed as an extension of more general discussions of research ethics, which are usually not based on visual materials, but are more around sort of quantitative or qualitative data sets that sort of historically, since the social sciences were sort of professionalized, really post Second World War, they've been the sort of core research and data, the evidence that social scientists have been using. So it's kind of, and the other track, which I think is important, that feeds into this, is actually from the medical sciences, who were the first set of academic disciplines to really have to think about ethics in particular ways. And I think the sort of combination of that sort of more sort of experimentation tradition from the medical sciences and the more text-based tradition from the social sciences, has kind of configured ethics into a discussion that's based quite a lot on ideas of rights. You know, who has the right to take a photograph, who has the right ownership right, copyright, you know, who has the right to be represented in particular sorts of ways. And it's also generated a lot of concerns about, obviously, you know, quite rightly, about consent, you know, who has the right to give consent to be pictured. And then in particular, and you know, there's quite a lot of discussion about this, the sort of default requirement that research data should be anonymised is clearly particularly challenging for visual materials that picture people as well. So there are various issues, you know, that frame the sort of mainstream discussion of research ethics, which I think mean that visual ethics get positioned a little awkwardly in. It's not impossible for sure, but it doesn't quite fit. But I think taking a step back from that, one of the things I learned, you know, I've learned from the kind of research projects I've done, thinking about, you know, sort of everyday uses of visual materials, is that I think ethics can take an awful lot of different forms other than that sort of rights-based, text-based kind of starting point. So, you know, there's huge amounts of feminist work thinking about an ethics of care, for example, and whether, you know, in that context, you know, perhaps particularly photographs, because they're these incredibly resonant, you know, almost sort of talismanic sort of objects, you know, whether an ethics of the gift might on occasion be something that we might want to think through, you know, something that's given without condition, as a, you know, as some sort of gesture, or for example, I think one thing that the sort of standard research ethics doesn't deal very well with, and I know some of your other speakers in this series have talked at length about this, is about the ethics of display, because the point of creating visual images very often is not only as a kind of research source, but also as a kind of, you know, public engagement project, or working with the people who made the exhibitions, or they're out there in the world, and I think that sort of that raises a whole set of ethical issues which I think are very, very problematic, actually very difficult to deal with. But also not really part of the sort of conventional discussion of research ethics in the social sciences.
Yeah, maybe you can expand on that a little bit about the ethics of display, and I mean, when you say it's problematic to deal with, could you give some examples of that?
So I think very crudely, and you know, there are all sorts of ways in which we could unpack this, but I've sort of got a vague model in my head of there's a sort of moment of sort of doing the sort of actual research in quotes, where, you know, to varying degrees, you know, with different sorts of relationships, you're working with a kind of set of research participants, and in some way, shape, or form, you know, photographs are emerging as part of that process. And then I'm sort of thinking, you know, there's some sort of analysis stage, you know, perhaps with or without your participants, but then you've got these images, and what do you as a researcher then do with them? And I think while sort of leading up to that, you know, there's a lot of sort of precedent and discussion and support for thinking about how those sorts of dynamics and relationships can be managed as ethically as possible. I think once you're thinking about putting things out into public audiences, then that sort of management and that framing becomes massively more difficult, and questions then, for example, of consent, you know, become really difficult, because, you know, say you're asking your research participant to agree that the photographs that they created can go on, you know, an online exhibition. You know, I mean, they could agree to that, and that's fine. But you know, what are they agreeing to? Well, in a sense, it's making the photographs visible. But of course, then there's this whole audiencing stuff that might start to happen, and that is entirely, you know, by definition, I think almost entirely out of the researcher's control in any way. So really the participant has no idea what they're consenting to. Indeed, the researcher doesn't either. And I think that's something that's particularly important in the current moment, where of course loads of academics, you know, and indeed, you know, sorts of organizations are using social media in different ways. You know, as we know, I think, you know, some of the tenor of debate and discussion on social media can be, you know, really unpleasant, vicious, you know, racist, sexist, and unwittingly, releasing images into that kind of could just be horrendously, unethical in its consequences. Although of course they weren't predictable or controllable. When I was writing the last edition of my my book on visual methods, I did come across, I'm afraid I can't remember the person's name now, a filmmaker who tried to get around this by when she screened her sort of research films with audiences, she always wanted to be present and run a question and answer session so that she could try and kind of manage the interpretation of the film, which I think is really, really interesting. And it might suggest that, if you're going to put images out in the wild, perhaps you need really quite extensive captions or ways of framing, or perhaps you need to try and be much more proactive in managing an audience's reactions to them, because people react to images, I think, in quite particular ways depending on the context. I think you need to engage with those ways of seeing as well as with the ethics of the actual production of the research image.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a photo says 1,000 words and they can be interpreted in so many different ways, and I think making it as clear as possible what you're trying to communicate with an image is so important. You've talked a little bit about feminism, and you're very well known for your contributions in the field of feminist geography. And I was wondering if you can tell us a bit more about how your feminist approaches to cultural geography underpin your understanding of visual ethics.
That's a great question, and it's quite huge. And actually, I found it quite a difficult one to answer, actually. But it was a provocative one to think through. So having said that, one of my sort of initial approaches to thinking about the ethics of visual images more broadly was work looking at the ways in which geographers, anthropologists had used photography as a tool of colonialism and racializing particular bodies, because the other massive literature that has very powerful things to say about that is feminist literature. And I was particularly interested in feminist film studies and the work of Laura Mulvey, for example, in talking about the male gaze. John Berger's really resonant phrase about men look and women appear, which again is all about this kind of relationality that when you're looking at an image, it's not just the people pictured in the image that are being represented or evoked, but it's also the viewer. The viewing position is also being, a particular viewing position is also being invited. And I suppose one thing that really intrigues me about, I mean, this is incredibly broad and really just my trajectory through some of these literatures, but I think that women as a very problematic category have a very sort of paradoxical relationship to the visual, because I think on the one hand, of course, there's an incredibly rich tradition of women have always used, visual media to challenge conventional notions of femininity, to push back against the way in which they've historically been pictured. But also, for many women have used images to sort of negotiate but also perhaps sort of enact and embed actually quite conventional notions of femininity, and that really came across to me in a project I did looking at with a group of mums who had young children, about how they were using photographs to in relation to their own experiences of being mothers. So it wasn't all about resistance, quite a lot of it was about embedding very particular forms of motherhood, but through the use of family photos. So I suppose all that is to say that I think the visual field is incredibly complex. I always end up saying, things are really complex. There are a lot of different visual practices out there. And I think it would be, perhaps useful if debates about visual research ethics, for social sciences, sort of, perhaps a bit more relativistic in a way about we have one set of criteria about what visual ethics should or shouldn't be, but there may be many others out there. Actually, there's a lot of other kind of creativity and visual practices in the everyday or more specialist forms, and I think engaging with that range of different ethical practices and conventions is a really useful and interesting process, even if you end up doing something quite standardly social sciencey. I think just acknowledging that there are these all sorts of vernacular knowledges and practices about the visual is a really important exercise. And I think feminism, with all its commitments to sort of the everyday and the embodied practice and so on, just gives you a really strong orientation towards that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting that you talk about racializing particular bodies as well. And you mentioned the male gaze, but there's also the white gaze as well. And I feel recently there's been a renewed emergence of the debates around decolonizing academia, decolonizing research. And I was wondering if you see any interplay between that kind of debate and visual ethics as well.
No, absolutely. It's totally, for all the reasons I've just been saying. I think with gender, race is absolutely inscribed visually on bodies, and there's been extensive, really long literatures exploring this, from historically, centuries. But I when I was writing Feminism and Geography, Bell Hooks talks a lot about the ways in which the white male gaze is a dominant. It's also able-bodied. It's straight. There are any number of ways in which cis, we would now add. There's any number of ways in which these gazes, and I think again that that makes the visual field really really complex. To negotiate, and that's one of the reasons why I think that social media is actually really fascinating, because I think these debates are very live, right there, very vigorous, quite heated, for really good reasons. But I think there's a lot of negotiation and exploration of exactly what these sorts of really complex intersections. And certainly in feminism and geography, I did try my best, and I'm sure it wasn't adequate, but to think about the intersections of gender with sexuality, race in particular. Also class, I think in the UK context, class in terms of, perhaps most obviously voice, but accent, but also dress, style, presentation of the self. That's really clearly visually coded as well. And the whole debates about how selfies are just these ridiculous, silly women doing. That was a highly class discussion as well, I think. So you're absolutely right. This is it's an intersectional field, and we really have to think about these things in conjunction.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in terms of the everyday photographer who's sort of publishing things on social media, do you think there's a greater need for public engagement with issues around visual ethics?
Well, yes and no, I suppose. As I said, I think at one level, there's an awful lot of debates going on already, precisely on social media. I'm on Twitter more than other platforms, but certainly looking there, I can see all sorts of debates happening. Particular adverts that are seen as sexist or racist get slagged off on Twitter, very, very quickly. We can all think of every week there's a kind of controversy, some advert gets criticised. There's a whole, there's a very lively audience there that now has the tools to push back. It's not just a kind of spray can of graffiti on the billboard anymore, which it was when I started thinking about these things. That there's an immediate and very wide audience for challenging the politics of representation. I think also that there's some great work coming out from sort of cultural and media studies scholars looking at, as I say, not just the sort of visual content, but also the ways in which people really reflect in kind of discursive conversations around different sorts of images. So I'm thinking here of a book by Kat Tiedenberg on selfies, which is a great example of sort of an academic sort of going out and actually discovering that there are these very elaborate codes of kind of etiquette. She's particularly interested in people who post what she calls sexy selfies, but how those selfies, the visual content is kind of self-managed, but also there's lots of ongoing discussion about how it's appropriate to like them or not, to comment on them or not. What's the right thing to say? What are the limits? Where you wouldn't post, how you would share. So very elaborate and thoughtful. And I think in a sense, as I say, academics could learn a lot, I think, from these nuanced debates. I'm not sure if by public engagement you perhaps you're proposing that the academic version of this might also help some of these academic, non-academic sort of discussions and liveliness. Is that also what you were asking?
I don't know, really. I think it's interesting what you said about that there's already engagement with ideas of visual ethics going on anyway, and it's just, yeah, so perhaps I think that's what I was asking, really.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I suppose the one difference is in terms of those lively sort of public debates, I guess, is that they're very sort of in the moment, and they're about sort of live criticism and commentary. And I think social science sort of knowledge production, huge risk another huge generalization, but tends, I mean, it's a different kind of knowledge, right? So it's meant to be longer term, based on more robust, reliable forms of evidence. And of course, we can debate endlessly about what exactly that means, but I do think there's something there around the sort of temporalities and the tone of discussions about research ethics in the social sciences might have something to contribute. But I think perhaps particularly around sort of archiving visual materials and what kind of archives, databases, whatever, are kind of valuable. What should we be archiving, and also how we should be archiving. So there's some really interesting work being done around, how do you archive social media? How do you tag images? What kind of retrieval mechanisms do we need? Is Google image search, is that sufficient way to sort of archive the internet's images? Well, no, it's run by a completely opaque algorithm that selects in all sorts of ways. So I think there's a question there, perhaps about a longer term archiving ethics of the archive that might be a useful one that academics could contribute to these public discussions, because, as I say, it's got a different sort of temporal angle to thinking about the kind of consequences of visual image production.
Yeah, interesting. I want to ask you now about your book that you published in 2010 entitled Doing Family Photography. And I know that work that you did for that book has influenced your thinking a lot on visual ethics. So I was wondering if you can tell us a bit about that work and how it shaped your thinking.
Yeah, so that was a project where I interviewed women about their family photographs, particularly women with young kids. And this was also a project that took place before digital cameras, actually. So this is kind of prehistory. And it was prompted actually by me, after our son was born, sitting at a kitchen table really late at night. I remember I was absolutely exhausted in kind of fog of it's just horrible. And what I was doing was spending ages with this big album with a whole pile of printed out photographs, kind of cutting them and putting them in and writing captions. And at certain points I looked up at my my partner, who actually loved taking photographs. He was doing something entirely, and I realised he had absolutely no interest in the albuming, or indeed the really strong obligation I felt that after every, I was taking loads of photographs of the baby, who was, of course, just lying there doing absolutely nothing, like the world's most boring photographs. But I felt I had to get them printed and then send them off to other family members regularly and add them into Christmas card. And again, he had no interest in doing any of that. And I raised this as a joke with other group of other new mums, and they were like, yeah, no, he doesn't either. So this is where the project was born, and it turned out that so I talked to women, but I went to their houses, and I was really interested in this whole thing about not only what did they picture, but what did they then do with the photographs. And what I found in the houses was this amazing, again, a kind of vernacular ethics, I think, of or at least etiquette or something, of having to take very particular kinds of photographs, having to display them in very particular ways in the houses, and then also having to send them to very particular family members. And it was women doing all of this kind of and in particular, they felt a strong obligation to send the photographs to their own mothers. So this was a really gendered practice, I found, at that moment. And this is where some of the kind of paradox of women both working with expectations of visuality, but also pushing against them a little bit. I thought women's approach to these photographs in a way really embedded their, sort of their mothering as a particular kind of, intergenerational practice, actually. But also there were ways in which I thought they were managing some of the more challenging aspects of mothering through what they were doing with the photographs. So I think that was my first real sort of close up. Although I've been sort of reading about the complexities of feminist and indeed kind of Black practices around visuals, that really brought home to me that there are these very powerful expectations about how images should and shouldn't be used. And it wasn't, as I say, it was not just the content of the image, it was also the whole thing about its presentation, its sharing, its display. And so, if you're thinking about visual ethics, the particular ethical dilemmas might change at each of those moments, but absolutely they're central to all of them, and that there are different practices other than the ones in which that were sort of being assumed as what social scientists should be doing with images as well.
So we've got quite a diverse audience here today that are also not from the research community. And I was wondering if you think that the ethical considerations of research photography are unique to research, or also applied to humanitarian and documentary photographers as well?
Yeah, mean, that's a really big and important question. And I'm sure the other photographers in the audience would have a better sense than me of a fuller answer. I do think that there is something distinctive about social science research, for sure, actually. I think, obviously that social science research takes enormous numbers of different forms, but I think there's something that that it is slower, it's more in depth, and there's very often a very particular way of sharing that knowledge, and that is different, I think, from the frames in which humanitarian and documentary photographers work, which they're framed. Those other practices are framed by different organisations, NGOs or media organisations, or documentary film festivals or whatever. They all have quite different expectations around production processes, around what the images should look like, and I think also in particular around audiencing. So those other sorts of photographers, I mean, the whole point is to make an image that will be shared more widely. I think there are certainly many social science research projects I could think of that work quite centrally with images, but choose never to share those images with audiences, beyond maybe the research participants themselves that they're working with, precisely often for ethical reasons. Perhaps that particular group of participants doesn't want to be displayed, or has particular senses of privacy, or indeed, perhaps photography wasn't the method used, and there's much less audience for other forms of visual documentation, I think. So for me, I think that there are probably two main differences between the social science and the humanity and documentary photography. One is this sense of a rather longer term project that's probably bolstered by other kinds of evidence as well, particularly interviews or archival work of different kinds, and is also then archived in its turn in a way that, in theory, is often, at least by default, meant to be open to other researchers specifically. But then also this question of audience. I assume humanity documentary photographers, the whole point is the broader audience, and that's not the case necessarily for social science researchers. So I think there's an overlap for sure, but I think there might be different sort of emphases and different, also some different concerns as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm going to come on to the last question now. And I just want to say that Elise and I are so grateful that you've agreed to be part of our series. Your thinking on visual ethics has been hugely influential in the way that we both strive for dignity and integrity in using visual methods in our research, and also when using images for public engagement with research as well. So thank you so much. And so the final question is, in terms of our audience, so we've got academics, practitioners, photographers, if they're looking to expand their understanding of visual and photography ethics, what do you think is the key message or messages that you would like them to take away from today's conversation?
So I think the key message would be just to reflect really carefully on, I mean, this is obvious, banal, really, but to think really carefully about the particular understanding of ethics that's being operationalized at all the different stages of whatever project it is that is working with photograph, whether that's a research project or a documentary project, or and I'm saying that I think because I think I don't think of ethics as sort of, you know, philosophical or moral absolutes, as I guess has been implicit, perhaps, you know, in all the things that I've been saying. Ethics are basically social practices. You know, they're decisions to manage social relations, you know, in particular kinds of ways. And I'm thinking, you know, about how you talk with people, how you picture them, you know, what you do with the things that you create with them. These are all social practices, in effect. And some of those social practices get embedded, you know, institutionally through things like ethics review boards, and but also, you know, through things like the expectation of the documentary format, or the protocols around, let's say, a photo voice project. You know, these are all particular forms of ethics, so they vary. I think they vary as a project moves through different stages and into different spaces. So the ethical considerations you might want to have, as I say, when you're working, you know, in a kind of community workshop, might be entirely different to the ones that you need to consider when you're doing an online exhibition. But I think finally, and just to return to your opening question, you know, that there are also different registers of ethics, and ethics is quite a broad term. And we've talked a bit about ethics that are based on kind of rights or property ownership, you know, who owns the image, who therefore has the right to say what it should be used for. But you used a couple of other terms just now, which was about dignity, about integrity. I think I mentioned earlier a little bit about care or about gifting. You know, there are a number of other quite different vocabularies and practices that different communities or histories historically have used. And so I just think, you know, reflecting on those and whether, you know, there are aspects of those that are appropriate to think through and work with, you know, that's also a really important aspect of all this. So that was rather a long answer to say that there are no absolutes or key messages. Like, you know, it's complicated, is probably the key message. But I think there are ways in which that complexity, you know, can be broken down into different forms of ethical practice that take place in different contexts. And just thinking through those differences, I think, is a really important step.
Thank you so much. That was. Thank you, Gillian. We are really lucky because Professor Gillian Rose is joining us live today from Oxford to answer any questions that you might have from the follow-up from our discussion. So I can see in the chat that we've had a lot of really good questions come in already. So thank you very much. I'll just have a quick look through some of them. So we've got a question here that says, you mentioned that interpretation can be outside of the control of the researcher, that the process of meaning of making is with both the maker of the representation and those consuming the representation. So with that in mind, should we choose images for display with the audience in mind? Or using images as a way to break down prejudice or reinforcing new narratives?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks to Anya, who asked the question, and hello, everyone. Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and I think it made me kind of remember one of the things that I didn't sort of perhaps say, that we didn't touch on in the conversation we had earlier, Catherine, which was around, you know, what shapes interpretations of images. And I think without doubt, what Anya's describing as demographics. I mean, certainly in the very sort of early moments when academics were starting to get interested in how things like news TV news programs were being interpreted, there was absolutely a sense that different demographics or different sort of class groups or different racialized gendered groups would absolutely interpret news programs in different ways. So the classic study here is David Morley's, who looked at a TV news program in I think it's the early 1980s, late 1970s. And he absolutely found that different identity groups, some of them agreed with the program, some disagreed, and others had this more kind of ambivalent approach. So I think the sort of demographics would absolutely be one interesting way to think it through. And I was thinking in particular, one interesting question for me is, back to the question of social media. And the overgeneralization that it's sort of young people who are more on social media these days. But I think that there's a way of seeing on social media that's actually very different from the kinds of seeing that we sort of assume when we think about visual ethics. So when we're thinking about a kind of ethical approach to imagery, I guess we are assuming that people will pay a lot of attention to images. Images really matter. The content will be decoded. But of course, if you watch any sorry, this is why demographics don't really work, because they immediately sound incredibly overgeneralized. But a young person scrolling through their Instagram feed, they're not carefully decoding every image for its representational content, right? They just like, and I think that raises quite an interesting question about what happens to visual ethics in the age of the kind of scroll and the swipe. And I don't have the answer to that. But I think in terms of younger people, or the age groups who are more likely to be on social media and using it a lot, I think that's a question we should probably start asking ourselves. And that kind of extends out into also the sort of place where images are seen, which I didn't really touch much on in the conversation we had earlier. But I think the physical location in which places are seen really matters. So if it is on a phone screen, on a platform, that's one thing. But also it might be quite different if you're scrolling through with a bunch of mates next to you and you're all laughing about the latest TikTok video. That's a different thing from you sitting late at night, but also things like gallery spaces. I think as soon as an image enters into an art gallery, it's not just a particular demographic that tends to go to art galleries, it's also the particular way of seeing that an art gallery invites as well, which is as particular as the scrolling through your phone or the other kinds of ways of seeing we might imagine. So I think demographics might be a start, but I think there's something also about the kind of media and the platform and the kind of places that would also kind of begin to shape and perhaps give us a bit of a handle on how a particular image might be interpreted.
Yeah, thanks for that really comprehensive answer. There's a really interesting question here about taking photographs in the public space, which I think is really interesting. So it's not necessarily a researcher going into a community and building up a relationship with a community, but rather just snapping things that sort of everybody can see. And the example they give is that it was a photograph of a homeless person sleeping in a bus shelter, and the photograph was taken without that person's permission. But even though it was in the public space, everybody could see it anywhere. I mean, do you have any comments on that? What does that mean for researchers using these sort of images?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good example of how the sort of formal ethics code kind of may well conflict with the other kinds of things that a particular project might want to value. So I think I'm correct in saying in the UK, or at least in England, you have the right to take a photograph if you're in a public space. You can photograph whatever you're nodding. I think that's correct. Of course, other places it may not be the case. So as long as you're in public space, you can peer into wherever. And of course, it's important to remember in that context that quite a lot of places that we think of as public are not actually public. So I was doing a research project that was trying to evoke the feel of a shopping centre, and wandered in with my camera and was basically told by a security guard about 10 minutes later that I couldn't continue taking photographs in that place because it was private, and legally, absolutely, that was. So I mean that particular example, I would imagine there's nobody in this meeting who would, well, who would think that's appropriate, that somebody should have their, because I think there is this sense of if you're photographing someone, you're kind of you are taking something from them in some way and taking it somewhere else, doing something. So I think that needs a kind of permission. So I think that's exactly a good example of the way the legal sense of ethics or rights actually is very likely to be in conflict with the other kinds of ethical issues that many of us would have in that kind of situation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, we've been having so many questions about visual ethics, but actually the legality of it is actually a very strong framework that already sort of exists to guide us in lots of things that we do anyway. So yeah, a whole nother series on that, I think. So we've got a question from May here about photography versus video clips, and what if you think there are any particular challenges or concerns for using video clips as opposed to photographs in terms of ethics.
Wow, I knew there'd be questions I would have no idea about. Well, again, you know, it's kind of context specific, isn't it? I mean, the immediate thing that springs to mind is that if you're under a requirement to anonymize images, but you still want to use them in some way, that's actually just technically easier to do, I think, if you're working with photographs rather than video. But that's an incredibly pragmatic response to that question. I think I need a bit more context, really. Yeah, I can't think of anything inherently different, though, other than the practicalities of maybe manipulating the images if you need to.
Yeah, okay, great. So I'll move on to the next question, and this is from Verity, who has a follow-up question about what you were saying about the overlap between the ethics of using visuals in social science and then in documentary photography. Just to clarify a bit, the differences between them, is that in the role of photo as process versus the end result? And can you speak about that, a bit about that, if the image becomes part of the research and perhaps informs an ongoing body of work?
Yeah, so clearly, Verity, thanks for the question. I mean, I was kind of splitting them off, and I have to say, you know, without a huge, you know, in-depth understanding of how documentary photographers work, so my apologies. And I can imagine all sorts of ways in which they overlap. I mean, I have a slight feeling that some of the very early sort of visual sociologists were kind of wannabe documentary photographers and never quite made it as that. So they decided they'd bring their sort of documentary eye to generating evidence for visual sociology as well. And I think there is something about, I'm not sure if this is ethics or not, but something about the sort of skill or that a photographer has, or the quality, in quotes, of an image, that question might speak to as well, because, you know, academics don't tend to be academics because we're great photographers initially, at least, whereas of course documentary photography, you absolutely hone your skill and your craft. So I can see an overlap for sure in different ways. But I think perhaps I would assume that the critical thing is that most documentary photographers, I mean, to put it really crudely, make a living by displaying the photographs, right, in some way, shape, or form, whether it's the book or the exhibition or whatever. So, and if there are other people in the audience who'd like to contribute to this, that'd be really be great to see. As I say, I think for social scientists, the display of the image is not so critical. Sometimes it doesn't happen at all. Sometimes it's like really pathetic little because most social science journals, it's really difficult to get images published in them, or certainly it was before so many of them went online. And even then, they're kind of maybe not very good quality. So I think the question of the audiencing is probably more of an imperative, and I guess then the sort of question of what difference that makes the sort of image it is to make it look an impactful documentary photo as opposed to an illustration embedded in some journal. I think there's perhaps something around the visual demands then that are made. So yeah, there's some overlap, and I was probably generalizing, but I think it's something about the display of documentary photography is more critical.
Yeah, we've got another question that's also a bit about journalistic photography. So it's from Ruth, who says that she comes from a socioeconomically deprived area of the UK that is frequently portrayed in the media through the lens of poverty porn. It's very, very frustrating for Ruth, this happening over and over again. And it's sort of asking the question about, should journalists be engaging more with these issues around visual ethics? But also I kind of feel that there's a bigger question there about who holds people to account in terms of these sort of guidelines around ethical practices. I mean, even if it's in social science, in journalism, in humanitarian photography, who is actually regulating it? And yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ruth. Thank you. So, so that concern about how places, particularly working class, localities, have been pictured in the media. Actually, geographers have been interested in that for a long, long while. And there's a lot of work done around exactly what you've been saying, that and this is about the politics of representation, that certain sorts of places only get portrayed in very particular ways. And I think conversely, if you want to challenge that, then you have lots of kind of really strong communities, led by women who are resistant and resilient. And so there's a very it's a kind of one or the other sort of option. And which leaves out so much other, other possibilities. And I don't know if that's, so I know a lot of newspapers and media now won't have their, again, maybe people in the room who can speak to this better than I can, but they won't have their own journalists, sorry, they won't have their own press photographers anymore. They'll be, employing freelancers who need perhaps to, I was going to say a bit like documentary photographers, but maybe the more extreme images are the ones that are going to sell, that are going to make them. And there's a lot of reliance on image banks as well for these kind of generic image types. And there's a researcher called Georgia Aiello at Leeds who's done some really interesting work on image banks and these kind of sort of cliche images of all kinds that are increasingly saturating advertising and journalism and so on and so forth. And the answer, I guess, there's nobody policing it unless it's communities themselves trying to challenge it. And I guess, social media can be quite useful there as a mode, and I think a lot of local, Facebook in particular, I think is a site where a lot of communities are organising around now. But it's a nightmare. And in terms of these broader ethical issues, I guess the politics, perhaps it's just horrendous. Yeah, and I don't think there is any easy solution to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've just had a comment from Margareta saying it also relates to portraying sort of one kind of Africa as well, which is a common phenomenon, and these kind of negative narratives around Africa get constantly reinforced as well, which is the same sort of issue, really.
And I say it's not just negative images of those places, it's also then what, how it constitutes the viewer as someone who's different, better, cleaner, whiter, whatever the, so it's that distancing process that gets enacted, I think, that's the really that's as important as these awful images. Yeah, absolutely. So we had a follow-up question from what you were saying about scrolling through social media, from Izzy, saying, how do you think the seemingly randomized and rapid nature of seeing images on social media is changing the speed of how we interpret images, as biases and judgments are forced to instinctively come up and then disappear so quickly, as compared to, for example, being in an exhibition or being in a magazine? Yeah, great question. So I don't really know, to be honest. And I think, social media is relatively new. And I guess one of the, sort of in historic terms, and I guess one of the, so the smartphone is like a decade old. I think we had to remind ourselves of that occasionally, because given the sort of slow, this sort of slowness of social science, I was sort of, I guess, advocating that in terms of it being sort of deeper. But of course, actually, it means that it's always a bit behind the times. And I think, this sense of sort of speed and swiping and so on. I mean, maybe that's a really good specific example to think through about how we might need a different approach to visual ethics, because certainly some of the theoretical work I've been reading around social media, which I think is really interesting, and it comes back, it kind of suggests that if you've got a photograph on social media, it's not the same kind of photograph, even if it's the same image file. It's not the same as if it's printed and framed in a gallery. It's a different kind of thing, and in particular, it's a different kind of thing because what a lot of the ways in which the social media platforms work is around trying to get this kind of smooth flow that then occasionally gets your attention, so that you're going to like something, that something's going to jump out at you. And people like Jodie Dean or Susan Parsonen have written about this is a kind of affective flow. That's what what happens when you say, oh, I'll just have a quick look on Twitter, and then half an hour later, you sort of suddenly emerge. And but if it's a kind of flow, and we're not looking at ethics. So did you lose me for a minute there?
Yeah, just for a second, but I think we picked up what you were saying.
Zoom is helpfully telling me my connection is unstable. Yeah, so if it's all a kind of flow and it's just about moments of sort of, you know, fun or shock, or, you know, what does that do to the notion of ethics? And for visual research methods, it's a real issue as well, because, you know, if most methods have been designed to look at a few number of images manually, well, if you've got, you know, if an individual is looking at thousands a day, well, you know, how then are you going to figure out what the sort of social consequences of that is? I think we need some different visual research methods as well as ethics, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that, actually, we did have a question from Elise about what your thoughts are on participatory photography or visual research methods, and in particular photo voice, which is a particular participatory photography method. And what are the concerns around the ethics of representation that are different to those of non-participatory photography?
Well, so I should come clean here. So it's sort of, you know, I don't really want to say, I've never been involved in a participatory research project. I've done photo elicitation and things, but not that real thorough, in-depth photo voice. So I'm not, you know, I certainly don't want to sort of pass verdicts on particular methods. But I suppose one thing that does, you know, you could say is that, you know, any research method is productive. I don't think any research method simply opens a window onto a sort of social real. They always shape things in particular ways, and I guess that's true of photo voice. It does particular things and not others, and it guess, you know, it's just a question of reflecting on, you know, what the implications of that are. Is that what you're intending to do? I think it's a little different from sort of participatory social science research. Again, I think its agenda is a bit different, as I understand it. So it might not be sort of, you know, perhaps appropriate to line the two up. So I don't have any grand thoughts, but maybe there are people in the meeting with lots of more experience who might want to pop something in the chat about that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So I think we're out of time and we've managed to cover most of the questions. But yeah, I mean, it would be so great to be able to continue these conversations. So please do get in touch with myself or with Gillian with any questions or comments or ideas for collaboration. We'd be really, really thrilled to hear from you. And I'd just like to say, Gillian, thank you so much again for joining us today. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, really got a lot out of it. And thank you so much to all the participants for your great questions as well. And yeah, I bring this session to a close. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye now.